Welcome back to the Unapologetic Podcast. Today I have with me a guest. I have Maude with me. And Maude, introduce yourself.
I would love to introduce myself, and I'm so happy to be here with you and anybody listening. So I work as a burnout prevention and leadership coach, particularly for women, but not only. So I work in the space of women growing their careers, taking next steps in their businesses, stepping up, usually expanding or transitioning in some kind of a way and wanting to maintain or even refine their health and their energy and their moments of joy and glimmers in a life, which, as we know, can be challenging in a society and structure such as the one we have now. So I love the work that I do in the world and consider myself very lucky to work with incredible, hardworking women around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you do is so important, especially right now, because like we were talking about just before this, everything feels so heavy, especially right now, but I mean all the time. And as women, we get burnt out from doing everything, just from doing all of the things all of the time. That's what we do. And it's so easy to just take that on. And then I feel like we don't even notice it because we kind of get to this place where it's almost like that's just how we operate. And then once I've found this, once like actually taken a minute to breathe, I'm like, holy fuck, I'm actually super burnt out.
Yeah, so I think you raise a really interesting point there around the societal expectations of women and that kind
Yeah.
of internalized take it on, take it on, take it on. And what I find with a lot of women that I work with is it gets to a point where we almost can't anymore, whether that be it's a health issue or it's perimenopause or it is having a baby or it is now somebody is getting sick and we're needing to take care of them. And there comes a point where all of the plates that we've been spinning and all of the kind of elaborate ways that we've coped and we've managed are at a point of crisis or transition, and there's a kind of breaking apart of what worked before. And that is a really, as you say, heavy place to be. And I think there's something about what are we doing where we're not noticing.
Yeah.
We're putting more in, and we're not really taking things out or saying no to things. But there's also something of recognizing the societal pressures on particularly mothers, but
Yeah.
women in general, around invisible labor, around emotional work, whether that be in a workplace or in a family, as well as then money earning responsibilities or business responsibilities. And so it's a real challenge to be in those situations and try and create change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's the big thing is it is really hard, I think, to break those patterns. And we have come a long way. Like we obviously, of course, my cat is always here. We've come a long way in some ways in breaking some of those patterns and creating some change, but then it feels like in a lot of ways we almost haven't. And we still accept a lot of the same, societal standards and just what society tells us to do and what we should do as women instead of being like, that doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, why are we taking on everything?
Yeah, so two things I'm thinking about as you're speaking, and I think it's challenging when we're in it
Yeah.
because we're so impatient for the change, right? We, as you said, there are patterns that have been broken, but we're in this kind of double bind of holding a lot, both in domestic spaces and in workplaces. But actually, if you look back, that change has come relatively quickly, right? If you think
Hmm.
about our grandmothers or great grandmothers, there's a huge amount of shift and change in roles that we're taking on, or ways of behavior, or freedoms and autonomy that we have now that we haven't had before.
Yeah.
What hasn't or isn't shifting at the same rate is our expectations of our male partners, right? Our
Yeah.
expectations of men in a society, and society's permission and legislation around how we see men traditionally, how we see providing, what kind of paternity leave we have, what kind of dispensations a country has to be able to support a more equal partnership, a more equal parenting. And so
Yeah.
from top down, we need kind of legislative change, societal change, cultural change to allow those changes in our home. So I think for all of us raising sons and daughters right now, is seeing them as part of the change. But the
Yeah.
other thing that I was thinking about is, often we are going first, so I think we are
Hmm.
at this, we're in this generation, and so I'm in my early 40s, and thinking about, my mother, my grandmother didn't necessarily earn her own money. They weren't necessarily breadwinners, right? So when we think about making money that matters, often this is the first, maybe second generation that we're in. So there's not a lot of role modeling around women in business, women having autonomy, women buying their own houses, making their own choices. And
Yeah.
I think that's challenging in and of itself, because we don't have those stories and role models and inspirations to look at so
Yeah.
much in our communities. And I think it's really wonderful that that's changing. We have much more visibility of older actresses, political leaders, maybe women in our community that are living different kind of lives. But I think there's also something here of recognizing often we might be the first to show up
Yeah.
differently within our family context, or maybe even within our neighborhoods, or within our business circles, or within our
Yeah.
career. So sometimes I'll ask women who are gunning for promotions and feeling insecure about themselves, like, who else do you see at the table that looks like you? And a lot of times their answer is no
No
one,
one.
right?
Yeah.
I'm the first woman of color, or I'm the first woman under 30, or I'm the first woman full stop,
Yeah.
who's been invited to Exco, or who has reached this level of business. So that's in itself a kind of, both a wonderful thing, and a weight and
Yeah.
responsibility, and a challenge, a going first challenge.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's like we are creating those stories that
Mm,
people will be looking at down the line. And it's interesting because, we look back at certain things that have happened and that we can look at. And it's like great to have those role models, but it's also thinking about like we have to be the ones that are now creating those stories and going first. And it's almost like getting into that mindset of like thinking about how they felt when they were doing that and when they were the ones that were going first and being able to do that ourselves.
mm. Yeah, and a lot of the women that I work with are really service oriented,
Yeah.
so service is a huge value for them. And I think sometimes when we frame our confidence, or we frame our visibility, or we frame our health as a service and a role modeling to those who come after us, it feels almost easier to recommit to that and to live
Hmm.
that kind of life. Because a question that I'll ask them is like, how would you feel if your daughter was doing that, or a friend of yours, or a sister, or your niece? And often there's a lot of care there. There's a lot of compassion. I would tell her she's doing great. I would tell her to take a day off. I would tell her health is more important. But actually, what I do for myself is I run a really tight ship, and I'm my worst boss, and I'm constantly criticizing myself, and often inviting that external perspective shifts things, right? Of
Yeah.
of seeing us role modeling, also being a rested woman, also being a healthy woman, also being visible and confident, as you say, a story to pass on, a story, an inspiration for others.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most important things is, when we can kind of look at that from a perspective of what would you tell someone else when we can see it outside of ourselves instead of just like trying to be so much in. It's almost like when I think of it as working with someone on their business and they're like, how do you spot the gaps when I can't? Because I can see the bigger picture, right? And it's kind of similar here when you can look at someone else and you would be like, I, I would tell them, take care of yourself. This is what you could do. That's what you could do. You could, take a rest here, take time off, and it's okay. But we won't do that for ourselves.
Hmm. Yeah, kind of heartbreaking when we say it out loud, isn't it? Hmm.
It is. It is. Because we're so hard on ourselves.
Yeah, and I think there's that, when we think about almost the first phase of burnout. So when we think about working in burnout prevention, one of the things that I might educate my clients on is the phases of burnout, which were researched in the 70s and 80s. And interestingly, the first phase is high expectations, right? Excessively high expectations of myself. So when we think about creating change in that cycle from running through the behavior that leads into burnout and then maybe taking a week off and having a rest and coming back and doing the same thing all over again, which I see a
Hmm.
lot of people do in
Yep.
today's work environment and environment in general. If we're never shifting that mindset of how do I see myself, what do I see as good enough, how do I what's my relationship to myself, what's my relationship to success, if we never look at that piece, we're going to repeat those cycles of sliding into collapse and coming back out and sliding back into collapse. And so thinking about the pressures we put on ourselves and the way we relate to ourselves as part of burnout prevention, as well as, taking the nap or setting the work-life balance boundary or, eating good food. What am I telling myself in my brain? What kind of pressure am I putting on myself? Because that's often going to lead to the behavior of
Hmm.
neglecting my health.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's it's funny because it reminds me of, when I'm talking about sustainable business, it's like, how do you set up a sustainable life? Because
Mm.
you also can't sustain that like go, go, go all the time, even if, like you said, you take like a week off and then you go back to it. You can't keep doing that over and over and over again.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that because my clients are really strong-minded, capable women, they often have sustained that pace for a long time,
Yeah.
right? So they've got like decades of evidence of hustling really hard and just scraping by the skin of their teeth. And then something starts shifting, and maybe that presents as a physical health problem, a muscular skeletal issue like panic attacks, lack of sleep. Something then comes and is knocking on the door over and over again. And because it's been so long and maybe even forever that they've been operating at a really kind of almost a peak performance phase, creating change in that to something that is different can feel wildly scary, right?
Yeah.
Because we almost don't know if we can survive it. And I think the piece that we don't talk about often enough in burnout prevention is the reward, societal reward that we get for perfectionist tendencies, for
Yeah.
high expectations, right? So when we think about women being rewarded for being good girls, for doing well at school, for smashing it
Yes.
within their higher education, for entering the workplace, for working late, for getting promoted, like all of that is really valued in the society that we work in and live in. And so to then get to the point of, oh, well, maybe I want to cut back. Maybe I want to work more sustainably. Maybe I actually want to say no to the promotion. Not
Yeah.
only does it go against our own lived experience, but it often goes against the messaging that we have maybe have received from our family of origin,
Yep.
as well as our workplaces. And so it really requires a lot of bravery to shift patterns of thinking and behavior around productivity, around success.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, yeah. I'm just like, it's so interesting that you say that because I've seen it show up so much. And even when I think about like when I left nursing and people were like, well, why are you doing that? And I'm like, because I know that I can't do that forever and have kids and deal with what's going on in my life and do all of these things. And it was looked down upon as this like bad thing that I was doing and like going against all of the norms. And it's like, but that doesn't make sense if I can't sustain it.
Hmm.
And it is this thing that's just, you know, it's been ground in so much over time that this is how we're supposed to do things and it can't go outside of anything else.
Yeah, and I think, what I see a lot of at the moment is then this kind of individual focus on like do more work. You do
Hmm.
more work to cure your burnout, and it's your fault that you're burnt out. So if you would just get up and have green smoothies and do a yoga
Yeah,
practice and do your deep breathing, like you'd be fine. And so
totally.
a lot of my clients are experiencing almost even more pressure because we're
Yeah.
seeing the failure to cope at that high level, or maybe even the lack of desire or the shifting in thinking to be working in that kind of at that kind of pace, as then something to be fixed in and of itself, with more doing, with more action, with more pressure, and placing that on the individual rather than, as you say, stepping back and looking at how we're doing work and life as a whole, as a society, as a collective. So when we think about that, almost the world that we're in, what's realistic around creating
Yeah.
change to prevent our burnout? And sometimes those are tiny tweaks, right? Sometimes they're really small behavior changes that give us a little bit more energy, a little bit more rest, a little bit more joy and fun to allow us to resource in them rather than,
Mhm.
I think a lot of people, when you get to the phase of absolute exhaustion, the temptation to like take a match and burn it all down is so real
Yep.
and so true for a lot
Yep.
of women. And I remember, chatting to a client, and I was like, well, have you tried setting some boundaries at work? And for her, that felt even scarier than like
Yep.
just leaving the company. So she was like, I'd rather quit
Yeah.
than actually say out loud, I'm not going to take that piece of work on. And when she looked at that, she was like, oh, actually, is there a piece of experimentation here with what I already have? So when we think about preventing burnout, I think a lot of us have like a drastic, I'm going to change my whole life. I've got to, move to Bali, or
Yeah.
quit
That's
my
always the
business
big
or leave
one.
my job.
The Bali retreat is going to fix everything.
But thinking about, well, what mindset am I going there with? And actually, could I right now in this life create some, as you say, sustainable changes so
Yeah.
that my day to day feels a little bit different? And then from a more resourced place,
Yeah.
could I think about what long term changes might I want to plan for? And often that feels a little bit more accessible than a radical upheaval.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're working with clients and they come to you, what are most often like the patterns that you see and the things that you try to implement with them to kind of break those patterns or change those things so that you can either like get them out of burnout or prevent it? I guess that's a lot of questions, but
It's a lot of questions, and it's really good questions, because thinking about where does this start? So where are people asking for help with? And two things come to mind. One is confidence. So lack of
Mhm.
confidence in themselves, in their work, in their values. So I often work with women who are going through transitions. So as I said, maybe they are stepping into a new role, maybe they are starting a new business, or they are wanting to elevate their business to the next stage. And so there's that kind of feeling of, am I good enough? And when we don't have a lot of confidence, it's really difficult for us to advocate for ourselves in terms of all of the things that you work with, right? Pricing or time spent or boundaries around work, because we're almost um, unconsciously working to prove ourselves and prove
Yeah.
our value. So when I think about themes that are often present, confidence is a big one. Setting boundaries is another big one. And then thinking about, where do I source my energy from? So a lot of the women that I work with are very output intensive, right? So they're holding space for other people. They are in their families, often the caretakers. They are at work, often a shoulder to lean on. With their friends, they are, managing and putting energy into social circles, maybe even involved in children's schools or education. So there's a lot of their energy going out, and there's not many places where they are sourcing energy from.
Yeah.
And so thinking about places of change there. So confidence, boundaries in terms of time, activities, pricing, and then thinking about energy management, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's so huge. That's something that I know I had to really work on because I'm someone who says yes to everything. I have a really bad tendency to do that and want to help everyone with everything. And whether it's like in business or it's in life, I'm like, sure, I 100%. And then I'll be like, why did I say yes to that? Like, and
Mm,
I want to help, but also I'm doing it at my own detriment.
mm,
And it's something that's so hard and I've really had to like work on and catch myself with because that is the thing that screws me over.
mm. Yeah, and it can be a lovely quality, right? Saying yes to
Yeah.
things and being available to help and support. And I think there's, when we think about those choices that we're making of, what do I actually have capacity
Yeah.
for, and where am I wanting to put my energy and my focus, and what are my priorities? Sometimes there is a yes, it would be delightful to help, and sometimes practicing the no can be so useful. And I find, when we think back to that theme of confidence, there can be so much fear in saying no. Will they still like me? Will they still think that I'm a good employee? Will they still think that I'm a good boss? Will they still want to hang out with me? Do I still belong in this community if I don't say yes to anything? And that kind of primal need for belonging in the relationships that we're in is such a huge one that comes into that.
Yeah.
So kind of looking at boundary setting as a practice, and a kind of, I've got a framework that I walk clients through to see where they are and what the edge is and what the next step is. But we say them very lightly. We say, oh, set boundaries like it's no big deal, and
Yeah.
actually it often goes to the core of how we see ourselves
Yep.
and our relationship with other people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it is such a big thing. It's something I talk about with clients in business. Boundaries are huge. And I think it it's this thing where a lot of people from the conversations that I've had and even the way that I feel sometimes like you don't want to come across as being the bitch when you're setting boundaries because you don't want to be like, "Oh, I'm unavailable," like whatever. But at the same time, it's like you have to do it for yourself. And there's a point where you, it is also taking care of you, and you cannot do everything.
Yeah, so just thinking about, as you were talking, I feel like loving boundaries, right, is a term that we don't often hear. And a lot of us equate boundaries to being mean, right?
Yeah.
Being abrupt, being harsh, being mean. And actually, when I think about boundaries as an invitation for somebody else to know me better, right? To know my capacity, to understand where I'm at, and vice versa, for me to be invited into somebody else's boundaries, right? Of them
Yeah.
saying actually what they want and need. There is almost an act of intimacy and a vulnerability with that, of being really honest about where we're at. And I think, for me, seeing boundary work as, in a way, relational work or intimacy work in a way changes the flavor of it a little bit. So that's, what I was thinking about as you were talking. The other thing that came up for me is, often I'll ask my clients, how do you see women who set boundaries? And they will say things like, oh my gosh, it's so brave, it's so inspirational. Like, I love watching them, it's like, I
Yeah.
have so much respect for them. I really admire them. And then, we flip it around, but like, I'm not allowed, I shouldn't.
Yeah.
I'm going to be perceived as a bitch. And that's a really interesting frame to think about. Well, how do I see other women or other humans maybe who have really clear boundaries? I remember years ago, about 10 years ago, I invited my friend out and she was like, nah, I'm just at home in my pajamas and I don't feel like it. And for me, the concept of saying no because you don't feel like it, right? There was no defense of, I've got other things, I'm so tired, whatever it was, making up a story. It was just like, no, I don't feel like doing that. It was
Yeah.
radical, to not do
Yeah.
something because you don't feel like it. Um, and I'll remember that. That was like, oh wow, I love that.
Yeah.
Are we allowed to do that? Cool.
Right? I know. It's so it's so interesting, and it speaks to, again, all of the things that we are taught by society, that like we're not supposed to
Mm,
say that. We're not supposed to pretend that we just don't feel like it sometimes. Like we're not in the mood to go out. Today is
mm,
not the day,
mm,
and for whatever reason, we're just not supposed to say that out loud. Like it's so weird when we actually say that out loud and like,
mm.
voice it, because it's not weird at
Yeah.
all. And it's
Yeah.
interesting.
And there's an invitation then from my friend for me to know where she's at, right?
Yeah.
Rather than her guessing what I wanted to hear and then trying to give me the answer that she thinks is going to please me, right?
Yeah.
So I love that. I love that example. And thinking about how we see boundary setting when other people do it. And that's not to say that it's always delightful. I've been on the other side of people setting boundaries to me and I felt hurt. I felt frustrated, or I felt angry, or I felt dismissive of them. And there's always that opportunity to think about, we often talk about setting boundaries, but we don't talk so much about receiving boundaries, and actually
Hmm.
how there's a very real impact often on a relationship or a dynamic. The last thing I was thinking about when you were talking earlier is, for me, there's also something interesting to think about, the individualistic culture that we're in. And so
Yeah.
the need to set boundaries as an individual has arisen from that. If we lived in maybe a more collective culture where there was collective care, right? Of, let me do this for you, or this is what, the family does for each other, or this is when we work and this is when we rest, and there were more collective rules around that, maybe there wouldn't be such a need for setting individual kind of needs and wants
Yeah.
within that. And I think that's something that I think we struggle a little bit when we have this kind of we mentality of wanting to serve communities. It can feel quote unquote selfish, right? To set a
Yeah.
boundary. But actually, because there's often no one looking after us, there's no one caring for us, there's no one collectively making sure that we are okay, that need has arisen. So I think looking at it again from the kind of lens of where we're at within a culture and our maybe loss of traditional care, collective care, and that leaning into individuals needing to look out and care for themselves often is a useful frame for women to remember.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's so interesting the way that you frame that because, yeah, it is like we have to do it for ourselves because no one else is going to do it for us if we don't. It's
Yeah.
so true, which I mean, that's kind of sad, but I mean, it's just, it is what it is. And there's some things I think of it as like, there are certain things that really suck, and that's one of them. But it's also like you have to acknowledge that and accept it to be able to do something about it. And the doing something about it means that you are the one that has to take care of yourself.
Yeah, and thinking about like maybe the community piece of that is that often it's really inspirational to be with other women who are talking about that, right? Who are talking about setting boundaries or thinking about what's worked for well for their lives or sharing their stories of how they manage time or energy or clients or fees or objections to those or boundaries at home. And I know that you run a couple of groups, as do I. And I think that's always just such a value of being in community spaces so that because it can be lonely
Yeah.
when you are being visible, when you are going first, when you are building business and career, and when you're not surrounded by other women doing the same thing. It can feel a little bit like, is this okay? Is this boundary okay? Am I allowed to ask for this? Do I have permission for that? Is this
Yeah.
unreasonable? And so being able to sense check with other people who are doing a similar thing, which may not be available in your immediate community, right? In your immediate orbit. And I think has been such a gift from the internet is being able to connect with women around the world who are maybe earning similarly to you or are a little bit ahead or are also in positions of power and leadership is such a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And I think, you know, I see that as there is actually around me, there's absolutely no one that does what I do. There's no one that knows what I do. And if I didn't connect with people online, I would be all alone. Like it would be really, really weird because I would have no one to talk to about this. Like no one really gets it because they have no idea. And it's not that I expect them to get it because that's not, it's weird if they did kind of because it has nothing to do with them. But I think that that is a really huge thing that we are able to connect like that. And it is really beneficial for us.
Yeah, and when I think about, so I've hosted two podcast seasons. The first one focused on kind of balance of time and energy and money across work and family for women who are both earning and parenting. And the second one was around perimenopause and menopause. And the
Mhm.
theme that's come out in every single interview with an expert or kind of a leader in her field was the value of community, right? And when we look
Mhm.
at the research done on both overall kind of well-being and happiness and longevity, interestingly, community plays such a huge role in that. And I think when we work in particularly the online space, but in small businesses in general, there can be so much invisible labor, so much
Yeah.
invisible work behind the scenes that not having people who know that and recognize that and validate that it's like, oh, well, it's just online, right? You work flexibly. Like,
Yeah.
what's the big deal?
No
And
big
so
deal.
having those kind of those spaces of connection becomes even more important.
Yeah. It, yeah, it really, really does. Because otherwise, people truly don't understand everything that goes into it because it is so much more than just, oh, I put up a post today. That was fun.
Mm.
It is so much more than that.
And I think particularly when we think about like leadership, and moving up in our careers or in our businesses, there almost becomes like less and less people that we are able to connect to. And so loneliness is another theme that comes up in the work that I do. Um, and looking at where can I find connections that feel true for me now, right? Not outdated from 20 years ago, but true for the me of, 2025, 2026. And what does she need? What is she looking for from relationships and from connections? Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are your most favorite things that you are doing right now? Like working with people or your speaking events? I know that you've had more of those. What are your like favorite things that you're doing?
I feel like my life is full of incredible work. I'm so grateful for the work that I do with humans in various forms. A couple of things that are absolutely delighting me at the moment is, so I work one-on-one with women over long term. So my standard coaching sessions or programs are 6 months. And for me, there's kind of a magic in seeing somebody change their thinking patterns, change their behavior, witnessing them through something like setting boundaries, building confidence, acknowledging their progress, settling into a new normal, right? Of being able to end work at 5 o'clock, have moments of joy, feel more alive. And so seeing, accompanying somebody through time is something that for me never stops being rewarding. For me, the one-on-one space of really being able to listen to people's stories, to be able to track their brains of what are they linking together, to be able to disrupt those thinking patterns that start going into criticism and kind of overwhelm is just a magical experience. And so I've been one-on-one coaching since 2018, and it is what I love most in the world. Um, the other thing that I really enjoy doing is in line with these moments of connection that we were talking about is I host in-person curated conversation events every 3 months. And I've just had one last week, which is why I'm still full of the bubbles of, energy that come after that.
Yeah.
And so those are conversation events, usually with 6 or 7 women, and we bring topics and we talk about them. So it's out of the traditional format of small talk about weather or, property prices or politics, the things that feel quite surface at some stage,
Yeah.
and really going into what's on our minds and on our hearts. And I love doing that. And then the other thing that I'm really enjoying at the moment is I teach on a coaching certification. I teach around stress and wellness, around ethical coaching, around somatic and visualizations, kind of bringing coaching into all levels of our transformation. And I find that people who are interested in becoming coaches or interested in human skills in general are just always really nourishing people to be with and around. So that's also work that I really enjoy doing in the world. So haven't even touched on the speaking work that I do. Haven't even touched on, and also I think the space that I work in, when I first heard the term high functioning depression,
Yeah.
I thought, this is such an underserved space
Yeah.
because a lot of the women that I work with have ticked all the boxes of success. They've got the house, the car, the husband, the kids, maybe the
Yep.
business or the position, and they are deeply, deeply unhappy. And
Yep.
because they are so capable and so strong, they keep on going, but there's something in them that feels flat, that feels sad, that feels empty. And there's not really a lot of space for those conversations and those emotions to be. So the fact that I get to do that with my one-on-one coaching, I think is just something that continues to light me up. Thank you for
Yeah.
asking. I feel like all like full of bubbles.
I love that though. And I know how passionate you are about it. And I just think that it's just so amazing. And I just like, you can feel when someone is doing like what they're meant to do. And
Mm,
I just love that so much. So
mm.
I just love hearing it because, like,
Mm,
I know that you truly just love the work that you do, and you
mm.
do make, such an impact with your clients. And that's,
Yeah, it's amazing to do work like that in the world. Like I'm sure you know the feeling, right,
yeah,
of being able to support people and see the ripples of that in the
yeah,
change, not just in that moment, but years later. I got a postcard from a client the other day that I worked with 4 years ago, thanking me and telling me that she's still using some of the conversations and frameworks in her day to day. And like, isn't that just such a lovely gesture? So yeah, very
yeah,
happy.
yeah. So the last thing I always ask everyone,
Hmm.
what is the impact that you want to make? It's like a loaded question.
So when I think about supporting humans to regulate themselves, their nervous systems, to make decisions that feel aligned to their values, to live lives in health and energy, what I see the impact of that being is on their children, on their family, on their work, on their teams. And for me, there's such an interesting piece of neuroscience around the spreading of regulated states, right? So when I think about impact in terms of the coaching work that I do, um, it feels like those ripples that we talked about, those ripples of confidence, of calm, of presence, of good decision making are so needed are needed more than ever, right, in the world that we live today. And so I feel like if I am a tiny little cell in the ecosystem of that, um, I'm grateful.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm,
I love it. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I
always a
absolutely
pleasure.
loved having you on. Where can everyone find you?
In real life in Cape Town, please come visit.
Yes, someday I would absolutely love to come visit.
Um, in the virtual world, I will put a link to my one-on-one coaching program below if people are interested in getting on a wait list to work with me in my one-on-one coaching. Um, I do also have a podcast, so you can listen to me interview some of the women that I referenced, which we can put down below. And there's also a burnout phases resource for people who are thinking, maybe I want to sense check where am I in terms of my thinking and my behavior. I will send you a link to a resource for that as well.
Amazing. Perfect. I will have all of that linked below. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been absolutely amazing.
Such a pleasure.
Yes. All right. Well, if you have loved the podcast, give it a 5-star rating and review. If you are watching on YouTube, I would love if you could like the video, subscribe, and as always, go after everything that you fucking want and be unapologetic about it.